Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Studio Art Department's Fall Term Artist in Residence lecture. My name is Colleen Randall and I'm a professor of painting and drawing in the Studio Art Department. First of all, let me say how wonderful it is to see you all here in person for this first time for some of us in over a year and a half. I hope the start of your fall term has been productive and that the rest of your year here will continue to be great. If you would all please take a moment now to check to be sure that your cell phones, laptops, and any other electronic devices are turned off as a courtesy for our speaker today. Thank you very much. Our guest today is Lorraine Shemesh, whose drawings, paintings, and ceramic vessels I greatly admire. Her career as an artist has spanned more than 4 decades. Her many outstanding artistic accomplishments have earned her widespread high esteem and praise among the artistic community, and we're especially fortunate to have her here today with us. In her catalog statement, Lorraine Shemesh writes that the work presented here was created during a time of trying to hold on while having to learn to let go. She also said the coming together of the figures of the paintings and drawings in the show and the banding patterns of alternating colors in the ceramic vessels are my response to the human desire for attachment, end quote. Her exhibition of this work, entitled Holding On, is now on view in the Jaffe Furedi Gallery at the Hopkins Center from September 21st through November 16th. The gallery is open Tuesday through Saturday from 12:30 to 10 p.m. and on Sunday from 12:30 to 5:30 p.m. Also, right next door in the Strauss Gallery is an installation entitled Scaffolding by our very own professor of printmaking, Tricia Treacy. Although it will not be possible to hold a large public reception in the gallery after the talk today, please do take time to visit the gallery on your own to view these revelatory works. The work of Lorraine Shemesh has been exhibited at the Butler Institute of American Art, the National Academy of Design Museum in New York City, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Frye Art Museum in Seattle, Musée du Courage in Switzerland, the Arnault Art Museum, the Boise Art Museum in Idaho, the Akron Art Museum, the De Cordova Museum, the Nassau County Museum of Art, the Institute of Contemporary Art, the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke, the Tryon Center for Visual Arts in North Carolina, the Alpha Gallery in Boston, and the Museum of the Rhode Island School of Design, among many others. Her work was shown exclusively at the Allenstone Gallery in Manhattan for 25 years and is now represented by the Gerald Peters Gallery in New York and Santa Fe. She has taught painting and drawing at the Rhode Island School of Design and Amherst College, and has served as a visiting artist and critic at many institutions, including the Maryland Institute College of Art, the University of New Hampshire, the Marie Walsh Sharp Art Foundation, and the Lincoln Center Institute. Earlier, a graduate fellowship in painting enabled her to study in Rome, Italy. She is a magna cum laude graduate of the School of Fine Arts at Boston University, where she was awarded a Distinguished Alumni Award and received her MFA in painting from the Tyler School of Art. She has received a Rhode Island State Council for the Arts grant, a Yaddo Fellowship, 2 watershed residency grants, and it was elected for membership by her peers to the National Academy of Design. Her work has been reproduced and reviewed in the New York Times, the New Yorker, Art in America, Harper's Magazine, Drawing Space, Form and Expression, Art in Auction, and the Harry Abrams book, American Realism, 20th Century Drawings, among others. I find her work to be masterfully executed and transformative, connecting us with our deepest human emotions. Now please join me in welcoming Lorraine Shemesh.
I am so pleased to be here and would like to thank Jerry Lawton and Colleen Randall for all they've done to give me this opportunity to share my work with you. My gratitude also to Glenn Suaco for designing the exhibition catalog so remarkably. It is no small gift that the Artist in Residence program at Dartmouth College provides this block of time and space for artists to develop new work while interacting with exceptional students and faculty. How wonderful it is to be able to gather together in person to have this conversation after being apart for so long. Before the slideshow, I would like to tell you a short story from a very early point in my life. I was always small for my age, and when I was sent to summer camp, although I spent most of my time engaged in arts and crafts, I also wanted to learn to swim better. There was a lake in which all campers were required to take a deep water test to determine their level. Everyone in my group seemed to sail through on the first try. I, however, failed twice, not being able to swim the distance before beginning to sink. Despondently kicking the water in the shallow part of the lake, where I seemed destined to remain, I was approached by a waterfront counselor. Embarrassed by my failure to pass the test, I had difficulty making eye contact with her. But then she said, "Lorraine, I would like you to take the test one more time. And this time, I think you might be surprised by the outcome." I shook my head, afraid that I was about to drown. She looked at me straight in the eyes and said with determination, "This time you're not going to think of the entire distance you have to swim. This time you're going to swim the lake one stroke at a time. If you get tired, swim on your back and remember to breathe." At the appointed hour, we got into the water. She swam ahead of me, holding a long bamboo pole in front of her, just in case I couldn't finish and needed to hold on. I swam slowly but steadily, remembering her words and watching her as I did. Her encouragement was palpable, and when I completed the distance without sinking, much to my amazement, I heard the sound of the applause of everyone in my group who had unexpectedly gathered on the banks of the lake to watch that day. I have returned to this experience in my head many times in the intervening years, and have never underestimated the part that mentors have played in my life. I was lucky to have had teachers who were also inspiring artists. They raised the bar for me by example of their own work and through the generosity of their spirits. I credit them for the fact that I was able to reach up beyond what I was capable of initially and aim for something higher, something deeper, and something more meaningful. While working, especially during times of uncertainty and challenge, I often think that light is light, but only in relationship to the dark. It reminds me not only of the formal elements that art making engages, but of the emotional components and the endless possibilities that a lifetime spent in the studio generates when one tries to do things again. The images I am about to show you represent some of those moments. I began my working life when I was 24 years old, teaching drawing and painting at the Rhode Island School of Design, a place where people worked in many different ways with a variety of materials. It was a very stimulating environment. During that time, I often traveled from Providence to Manhattan. Since I was classically trained to work directly from life, I drew what I saw during those trips. When I decided to develop the drawings into a painting, I had a real train seat from the New Haven Railroad unbolted from an abandoned car and brought into my studio for the model to pose on. The painting measures 60 inches across. From the very beginning, the paint quality was an essential element in the process for me, as thickly painted areas were situated next to more transparent passages. Here, the opening up of the edges was used to increase the feeling of vibration as the train moved. I set up my easel in a friend's home to work on this painting. An interest in the graphic black and white tile pattern on the floor was the starting point. The title gets its name from the fact that the details of the landscape and the window were competing for the focal point of the painting. So I turned on the hot water in the shower to fog the view outside the window. Its title became Steam Heat. Sometimes the hardest thing about painting is the editing and what you choose to leave out. After 7 years of teaching at RISD and 1 at Amherst College, I met Alan Stone, whose gallery would go on to represent my work for the next 25 years. Soon after meeting him, and against the better judgment of everyone I knew at the time, I decided to move to New York City to make my way as a painter full-time. I worked on this painting from my apartment window when I first moved there. The image pays homage to Edward Hopper, whose work I greatly admired. The repetition of rectangles are the underlying foundation of the composition. Here is a detailed shot of the smaller painting. The juxtaposition of old and new constantly changes in this city. But what interested me were the light striations. They were simplified and elongated in the course of working on the painting to enhance the sense of dramatic movement across the canvas. This work was also painted on the spot, working from another friend's apartment window, overlooking the building's rooftop. It is 42 inches square. The light pattern represents the use of composite shapes developed from different moments of the day to keep the viewer's eye moving throughout the canvas. The composition repeats a series of triangles. The complementary color structure was built on a heightened relationship between the blue and orange areas. At a certain point, it became evident to me that I couldn't keep imposing on my friends and moving my studio around from site to site. I returned to my small space to work on this triple self-portrait. The painting is built on the repetition of circles. As you can see, simple geometric shapes like rectangles, triangles, and circles often form the foundation for my paintings. Simultaneously while painting, I have often worked with other media in order to ensure a fresh eye and keep me thinking outside the box. On the floor of my studio, I began to work with fabric to create large hand-appliqued quilts 8 feet high. In drawing the image from my head, I was able to flatten the figures and increase the movement of shapes across the composition. This one is titled Acrobats and measures 100 inches in height. Drawing the figures on huge sheets of paper on the floor helped me change my point of view in the paintings that came afterwards. When the quilts were shown alongside paintings and drawings in a solo exhibition at the Allenstone Gallery, someone I deeply respected saw the show and said to me, "You have everything it takes to go the distance, but now you need to go to the place you're most afraid to be." I was jolted by those words. "How do I do that?" I said. The response shook me. "I don't know. I don't care. Get a pickaxe if you have to, but go there." I realized it was time to enter deep water. A few days later, I began the drawings for a new painting titled Backfloat, which presented many unanswered questions. Trying to find the answers resulted in a series I worked on for many years called Painted Pools. The composition in this painting titled Crawl is built on a series of concentric half circles. It occurred to me that if the models I was working with posed lying on the floor, I could draw them standing on a ladder from above. This small drawing, which is about 11 inches high, establishes the fundamental structure of the composition for the painting that followed. It is graphed to enable me to develop the composition on a larger scale later on. There were many drawings between this linear study and the finished painting which follows. The linking of the figures and how they hold on or let go in space has been of deep interest to me. Most of the models with whom I have worked have been professional dancers with very flexible backs that contribute to the fluidity of the poses, first struck on the floor in my studio, and then later on in the water itself, where I photographed them. I then returned to the studio to rework the compositions and various elements of light, color, pattern, and space. The process often takes many months in order to bring the painting to life. Drawing is the bridge in all the work that I've done. It is the manner in which my ideas first begin to germinate, regardless of the medium that I eventually choose to develop the piece. I do a lot of drawing before beginning a painting as part of the process of gathering information. This more elaborate drawing and its detail shot below help me to establish the striated light patterns for the painting that follows, which is called Loop. It measures 79 inches across. When working with the human figure, one is dealing with a charged form, psychologically, physically, and certainly visually. The question I ask myself is, how do you bring the figure to life and give it a pulse so that it can express something about the human condition in poetic form? There are certain conceptual issues that I'm confronting, like disjuncture and harmony, the politics of communication, and how to use the figure in today's world and make it relevant, something vital and sensual that expresses nuanced feelings. The image below is the detail shot of the male head so that you can see the paint quality. Here's a studio scale shot working on the floor for greater reach, on a painting inspired by a whitewater rafting trip to the Grand Canyon, during which I watched the whirlpool effect of circulating water take hold daily. The water formed eddies, moving in circular patterns, which is how this painting got its title. Here is the finished painting. It measures 66 inches square. Martin Lofsness, a principal dancer with the Martha Graham Dance Company, posed for this painting during a hiatus from performing with the company. He posed in a pool situated in the woods, surrounded by dark green fir trees, which contributed to a different color palette in the painting. When one element is changed, it changes everything. The paint handling in this detailed shot of the feet is an homage to the painter Soutine, whose work I greatly admire. This series of 3 paintings titled Archway, Arch, and Arc was inspired by the Matisse bronze bas-reliefs hanging in the garden at the Museum of Modern Art. The figures were handled in an increasingly abstract manner as the series continued. The form became flatter as the figures dissolved into the water around them. This painting is the middle painting in the series. It measures 80 inches high. The merging of the figures' forms with the light patterns in the water became of great interest during the process. The detail shot of the hand on the left follows. Many small gesture drawings are done to develop an idea, which I often try in different media. I was playing with tethered circles while figuring out this composition. The edge tension between the shapes and the perimeter of the canvas in this small drawing became of great interest as the work developed into the lithograph that follows. In this 2-color lithograph, the form was developed allowing the white of the paper to serve as the light source. The larger painting that followed employs the same composition of tangent circles, which enabled me to emphasize the warmth of the light from the sky in a view from below against the cooler areas in the foreground. The complicated process of working on a painting for many months sometimes necessitated that I step back from the canvas and work with simpler forms in clay. The chance to do this opened up a whole new way of thinking for me. I began to create patterns on small vessel forms. When I began to work with clay, I was drawn to the fact that the process employs all the elements: earth, air, fire, and water, using a Japanese technique called neriage, which embeds the pattern on the interior and exterior of the form simultaneously. This is a composite piece, 16 inches high, that was conceived in sections from drawings and then assembled when the clay was leather hard. This piece was hand-built using coils of clay twisted together. The organic nature of these patterns helped me to become more interested in the light refraction in the water in the paintings and drawings that followed. Influenced by the malleable manner in which clay moves, I began to focus more on the abstract shapes pulling off the figure in this drawing called Spots, which is 24 inches square. If abstraction and figuration are 2 stones, the spark happens when the 2 are struck together. This painting is called Wings. There was a wildness and freedom in working this way that I was thrilled by at the time. The merging of the figure with the refraction pulling off the leg helped to reinforce the zigzag movement in the overall composition in this painting titled Lunge, which is 68 inches high. The next shot is the detail of the light striations wrapping around the upper torso. They were painted thickly, helping to increase the volume of the form, and were of interest to me in their relationship to the flatter areas of the refraction. The meeting of the pattern at the seam in the bathing suit in this drawing was initially problematic. The question was, should the pattern simply continue around the torso unbroken, or break at the seam in a more haphazard way? Thinking that I would shoot for a more improvisational feeling like that of jazz, I decided on the latter in this graphite wash drawing called Echo. Here's a studio scale shot working on the painting Ghost, which measures 72 inches in height. and the full painting, the figuration and abstraction are playing off each other in full measure here, and the dance between the two is what held my attention. The painting takes its title from the abstracted head in the refraction, a detail of which follows. It is a nod to Jean Dubuffet, whose work I have always respected for its bold directness and power. My early interest in black and white check patterns returns in this large 75-inch high painting, both in the foreground figure and the invented refraction. Its title, Crescent, nods to the repeated concentric semicircles to keep the painting moving. Here's the detail of the refraction in the upper half of the painting. The invented distortion and fluid aspect of the pattern was influenced by a small ceramic piece that I had made from woven clay. The symmetry of the warp and weft distorts as the clay is handled while wet, and the resulting patterns always surprise me. Around this time, I lived through a period of grief. For the first time in my life, I found that I was unable to work with such vivid color and needed to find another way to proceed. So I designed and fabricated black and white striped unitards that included meshed hoods for the models to wear, so that when the figures moved together on dry land, they would appear to be one unit. This is a photo of my studio wall, which contained some of the initial studies I showed the models before beginning to draw them. I initially imagined the figures as dancers on a stage, spotlit in front of a black background, so that the white abstract shapes would come together and pull apart as the dancers moved. I brought the dancers into my studio, showed them the drawings on the wall, put on some music, and asked them to move from one gesture to the next. I made small, quick gesture drawings, like the image on the left, which is 10 inches high, to establish the pose for the painting that followed, which is 6 feet high. The next image is the detail shot of the center of that painting, and you can see the graphic quality of the black and white bands running across the figures. The repetition of arcs is the underlying compositional element in many of these paintings. The composite shape that the models make in this work, called hook, is enhanced by the fact that they share a limb, as her right arm becomes his left. Again, the most difficult thing about painting is the surgery that is necessary, not what you put in, but what you take out. I titled the series of paintings Intersections. They were inspired in part by the formal elements in the following clay piece that I had made earlier. The design for this ceramic teapot, seen here in 2 views, was conceived using similar repeated arcs to build and enhance the form. The making of this piece was one of the most challenging things I have ever done. It consisted of carving a model out of plaster of Paris and then creating a 17-piece plaster mold from the model into which liquid clay was poured. In this way, multiples can be made. The small linear gesture drawing on the left establishes the armature of the pose, while the flat black and white pattern study done in gouache on the right isolates the stripe distribution across the figures' bodies. Both of these are relatively small, 10 inches high, but led to the larger paintings that were fully realized over a period of months, which employs the curved arced form of the limbs to unify the stripe pattern, moving across and joining the torso and legs. The simple geometric shapes, once again, circles and rectangles, are used to stabilize the composition. The handles on either side of this slip-cast work are used in the same way as the arms in the previous painting. The preparatory work for a larger painting is fairly extensive as the drawings develop in greater length as the process continues. Here is a study done with lithocrayon on vellum. The separation between the figures in this composition is almost completely obliterated as the abstract shape relationships begin to take hold more forcefully. The oval shape of the design is repeated in the following clay vessel. The pattern was embedded to create movement by employing light and dark coils, which were then twisted together, scraped, and pushed into shape. I was standing on a ladder one moment as the models were taking a break in the studio between poses, and when I looked down, I saw this and said, "Hold that." The finished painting, which was the result of that moment, is called Checkmate. It's 80 inches across. The detailed shot of the woven legs appears next. Pattern on form can be translated in many ways. In this instance, it relates to several clay vessels I made, weaving black and white clay later on. The weaving together of the light and dark coils is akin to the light and dark of the human experience. Clay has a memory, is sensitive to touch and temperature, is easily broken, and greatly affected by the atmosphere in which it finds itself. Much the same thing can be said for the human body and the ephemeral nature of life itself. Here, the intertwined limbs are dealt with in a more improvisational way, increasing the sense of abstraction in the painting, which is titled Tangle. It is 52 inches high. This studio shot was taken while I stood in front of the work before it was shown. After the exhibition, I was invited to join the Gerald Peters Gallery, which, along with their exhibition space in Manhattan, presents work in their mothership gallery in Santa Fe. This opportunity prompted my first trip to New Mexico, which had a profound impact on the work that followed. In New Mexico, I interpreted the layered rock formations as the Earth's memory and witness to the changes in the Earth that have occurred over time. This experience greatly influenced the return of color to my work and the warmer color palette of my paintings and ceramics afterwards. Here are two different stoneware clay bodies that were woven together and compressed to form the vessel. The circular movement in this pattern of twisted coils generated the inspiration for the paintings that followed, like this one, titled Jigsaw. I nodded more overtly to my lifelong interest in dance in the works titled The Space Between Us. The line of the dancers' flexible bodies allowed me to configure images with extreme gestures and the sense of expressiveness that I was looking for. The pattern here was made by weaving together origami paper that was cut in asymmetrical strips to achieve a more surprising outcome. The imagined box structure containing the figures was invented to play off the more organic weaving of the model's limbs. This painting is titled Riddle and is around 62 inches square. These works were conceived in two different media, but make similar use of the oval void shape used in the center of each piece. The dialogue between the 6-foot painting on the left and the 6-inch ceramic vessel on the right provided clarity in the making. The subtle movement of the two figures is camouflaged by the overall asymmetric pattern in this imagined space in the painting titled Inseparable. The handling of the paint is seen in the following detail shot of the lower figure's head. The opening of the edges helps to give a sense of the fleeting nature of the movement. The shallow space in the design of this painting, titled Accordion, contributes to the feeling that this could be a bas-relief. as the pattern runs across the figures and into the surrounding space. Various paint viscosities are used to develop the form in the following detail shots of the upper head and lower hand. Another studio shot while working on the painting attached, which is 64 inches high, to give you a sense of the scale of these works. The difference between ballet and modern dance has to do with the fact that ballet denies the existence of gravity. So all the movement is upward towards heaven, while modern dance acknowledges gravity's existence but mourns its presence. So the movement is downward towards the ground. This painting nods to both forms of expression. The use of colored bands to encase the figures was inspired by small ceramic pieces I had made earlier, like this one, which is only 6 inches high, here shown in 2 different views. The imagined box containing the figures is repeated in their gestures, informing a simple rectangular structure and reinforced by the overall shape of the canvas. Here is a detail shot of the upper portion of the painting, which you saw earlier in the introduction. The painting is titled Trellis, is 62 inches across. The asymmetric pattern that occurred in the twisting together of 2 different clay bodies, porcelain and stoneware, was responsible for the cracking that occurred when the piece was high-fired, because the clay bodies dry at different rates. While the cracking was initially concerning for me, time allowed me to think about it differently. I heard that old Leonard Cohen song called Anthem. The lyrics go something like this: forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. How beautiful a thought is that. I allowed the feeling of circular motion generated by this piece to feed into several of the paintings that followed. Like this one, created during the beginning of the pandemic, when things felt so precarious. The process of working on it helped to anchor me and take one day at a time as I remembered to breathe. Here, the slight 3/4 view of the 2 figures in the painting titled Magnet increases the sense of depth in the imagined box in which they are situated. The detail shot of the foot is a witness to the fact that professional dancers are often encouraged to fall during rehearsal so that they may know the tipping point of any given movement. Seeing them on stage at that moment, right before they pull back and find their balance, makes you hold your breath before exhaling again. This has been a precarious time for all of us, and the work witnesses the search for balance and the wish to come together once again. The contact point of holding on lends a sense of being anchored. It was a seesaw negotiation as I worked to develop the 2 figures into a single unit. I had begun the drawings for this last image years ago, but was unable to resolve them, and so I set them aside. Sometimes stepping away from an idea helps to find a solution later on. During the last few months, I pulled the drawings out again and realized that there was a way to unify the painting that had eluded me earlier. In closing, I would like to say that a lifetime spent in the studio guarantees that there will always be unanswered questions. That's what draws you back in. Sometimes the water we find ourselves in feels too deep to navigate. Staying afloat in unknown territory is not easy. It is, however, extraordinarily engaging. Every person trying to make something from nothing finds their own way to swim the distance. For me, the ability to focus and swim the lake one stroke at a time while simply remembering to breathe has carried me through to places I had never imagined I'd go. Thank you.
You would stay, we'll have a question and answer session. And normally, we pass a microphone around, which is impossible today. So I'm going to kind of be an intermediary and go through the audience and try to hear your question and then come back up here and say it on the microphone so everyone can hear it. So, anyone with questions? I actually have one. So, I will ask my question and then I'll come back out of the audience. But I was hoping, Lorraine, you could talk more about the edges of your paintings. I'm really fascinated by what happens. Often you have like a warm or cool painting and then around the edges you see some of the underpainting and it's often cool or something. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Earlier on, my paintings were much tighter, and I found when I closed the edge, the air would begin to go out of the image. I always liked those early paintings when I was beginning the process, and then they seemed to die a slow death as the weeks and months went by as I polished things up. And I think the act of working with clay, because you can't control the material, every time you touch it, everything you do to it becomes part of the finished piece. For example, if you are making a small vessel and you make a dent in it, and then you remove that dent, when it's put in the kiln, the piece comes out with a gash where the dent was. It's like a damaged childhood. Clay has a memory. And I decided that I wanted to have that kind of energy in the painting. And so I thought the way to achieve that was to keep the painting open. And I would finish working for a day and then scrape it down. And I liked the way the painting began to stay alive in a different way and have oxygen. It didn't need to be resuscitated in the same way it did when I closed the edges. Also, when you're working with live models, what is difficult and exciting is that they move as they settle into the pose, and there's a quiver. There's a quiver as they move from one pose to the next. And I like that feeling, that it's transient, that things are not glued down, they flutter. So opening the edges and using complementary colors. I often draw, if the image is primarily warm, then I draw with a cool color, making corrections and readjusting positions. And I kind of like the vibration of the opposite color sitting next to the primary color that's being used. You're welcome. Anybody else?
Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to come over here. You can stand up and say it, and I'll try and remember it.
My question was, what types of tools and techniques do you use when you're painting?
What type of tool? I use oil paint because oil paint I find is more malleable. It doesn't dry as quickly. I use bristle brushes, sable brushes, all different kinds of brushes, and I use also the stick end of the brush, which is more raw. It gives you a more raw kind of line than using a very thin brush where you get a precise line. I would say it's wonderful to try all different kinds of materials to see what works best for you as you develop your work. It's good to have things to choose from, and things surprise you. You know, I also work with my fingers, you know, and I learned over time I should wear gloves when I do that because some of the pigments are toxic. So, you know, good to be safe when you're doing these things, but, you know, I will sometimes put the stick end inside a latex glove, and it will pull up the paint. You can make a mark, a drawn mark. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Yes. So, yeah, thank you so much for your talk. I'm especially moved by your opening story. My question, I think, because I'm a photographer, I want to ask a question about on perspective. I guess it's going to be a little bit long, and maybe it's also a comment, so bear with me. So, in your earlier paintings, I see you more strictly follow perspective and to show kind of like showcase what you also in painting things realistically. And later on, we saw those underwater paintings. It seems like you're more free, not following perspective that much. And in the even later paintings like this, in one painting, I see the transition from really realistic parts into quite abstract parts. So, yeah, I want to ask you what your thoughts on perspective.
Well, that's a very astute observation. You know, you're looking at work that was done over a period of 4 decades. So I think the earlier work, I held on to the form very tightly. You know, I think the difference between having less experience and more experience is that you relinquish control as you go on, and you let the material take you to where you're trying to go. In the beginning, I was trying to control the material. The edges were tighter, the forms were more carefully realized, and I didn't allow I was dealing with the very simple geometric shapes. In the later work, the paintings would evolve. You know, a lot of it is made up. I mean, there is the drawings to refer to, and there was the photo work to refer to, but in the end, I made things up. I just looked at the painting. Sometimes I actually, even though it's a figurative piece, I worked on them upside down to see how the forms and the shapes were moving, and the movement became what was important. And I was, the wonderful thing about working in the water was that it gave me the latitude to try things that I couldn't get to as easily on dry land. I thought, you know, I can believe in this world that I'm creating because it's like being in outer space. But I learned so much from doing that for so many years that when I did do these more recent paintings, you know, the abstraction was already built in. The thing that's harder to do is to simplify things. You know, I think when you're beginning, one is more invested in the stuff, in the details, in painting all the little things, but that isn't what makes the painting, doesn't give the painting a poetic feeling. It's the air in between the things that's more elusive, but that also is responsible for the moment of magic. And it happens when you step back and see what the painting needs, not what you want it to do, but what it's telling you it needs to do. You have to trust that. And it takes time and experience to do that, but it does happen eventually. And it's a wonderful feeling. You know, you begin to feel that the brush is an extension of your hand. You know, it's not this outside object. You begin to do it more organically. So I hope that answers your question.
Anyone else? Yes. I know that you've spent a lot of time like teaching art as well
Absolutely.
Like keep learning when you're kind of like solitary?
It's a good question. Stepping away from teaching was a difficult thing to do because I did learn as much from my students as I hope that they learned from me. But being in New York City, you need to be very resourceful very quickly in order to make a go of it. And I did a variety of things in those first years. I worked in a costume factory. I did freelance work. I worked as a food stylist. And I met a lot of different people. And, you know, when you're worried about paying the rent, you know, when people would say to me in an ad agency, can you do storyboards? I would say absolutely, having no idea what a storyboard was. But I knew that I could draw. And so, you know, I learned very quickly. You know, I don't think I could have moved to New York when I was 20, but by the time I was 30, I had more confidence in terms of what my skill set was, and I found a way to earn a living that enabled me to support my life as a painter. And when I was doing the other work, I did make time to paint every day. You know, that was my priority. I was very, very focused on putting together a body of work. And so I was stimulated. Even though I wasn't in a classroom, the city was my classroom. And it's a place that's alive and it's vibrant and there are all different kinds of people from all different places. And I found that to be extremely exciting. So I would say my education it was a different kind of education, but it absolutely continued. And working with different materials, you know, took me, when I was working on the quilts, I found there's a fabric district in New York City. There's an area where they only have blocks of stores with feathers. I mean, there's so many opportunities to find new materials to work with that I found it thrilling. And, you know, it's open 24/7. You know, I remember when I first moved to the city, I had to go to Kinko's at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I wasn't sure they'd be open. But they were not only open, there was a line at 2 o'clock in the morning. You know, everybody is working and working on their dream and trying to pay the rent. And it was wild, but it worked for me in a very good way. So that would be my answer to that. Learning continues. Every person you meet in your life poses questions that you hopefully spend the rest of your life answering for yourself. That's what having a life is. And it begins in a classroom, you know, and that's a wonderful experience. But when that experience is over, you go out into the world and you continue to learn. That's the gift. So, anybody else?
I was just wondering, how did you decide on the size of your paintings? Because some of them were so large it looked almost uncomfortable to do painting in the middle. How did you decide?
You know, I like to work big because I feel like when I'm doing that, I'm entering the world. You know, when I work small, besides the fact that I need to have a different prescription for my glasses, I'm bent over the piece. It's not as comfortable for me. When I work large, I'm standing up and I'm using my arm. And you're enveloped by the color and the shape. And I feel like if I enter the world, the viewer will enter the world too. And oddly enough, I lived in my first years in New York in a very tiny space. But I still worked really large. And I got a little reducing glass, which I would look through it and it would look like I was 4 feet away, that helped me to do those large paintings in the small space. So I did small drawings as I was making the paintings, but the paintings were pretty large. The more recent paintings are slightly smaller, but they're still large. I mean, the figures are life-size. I like it. You know, I think it's not a question of right or wrong. It's a personal choice. It's how one is comfortable working. And I'm comfortable working in front of something that's going to give me a run for my money. It's like I'm pushing against this object that's my size or bigger. And I enjoy that. I enjoy the process of that.
Any other? Yeah.
You said at one point, someone told you you need to find a place your emotions ready to go.
Yeah.
Do you think you found that, or are you still looking for that?
Well, if the last year and a half didn't put us in a place that we were afraid to go, you know, I think there are always elements of our lives that are overwhelming and frightening. When in my early work life, I would try to avoid those subjects and places when I made things, and then I stopped doing that. I realized that when I was uncomfortable with something, that I needed to sit with that and maybe use that. And in the doing of that, it was easier for me to deal with whatever the difficulty was. You know, that early story I told you was a sweet story of a child at camp, but at the time, you know, I was terrified. And so years later, the water, it's beautiful. The water is beautiful. It's luminous. It's, you know, the light and the sparkle of it and the pattern. But you can also drown. You know, there's that element of the light and the dark sitting together. And in the last year and a half, you know, not being able to see people, you know, being afraid of being sick, watching people be sick. At first, I thought, I mean, I was in New York City, you know, where the virus was everywhere. You know, the sirens and it was awful and terrifying. And at first I thought, how am I going to get through this? And then I began to work. I thought of coming here. You know, I was supposed to come here last September. And I thought of this moment and what I would say to you. And I thought I'm going to own what we've all experienced. You know, the challenge of it and the uncertainty of it. And the work that I made helped me immeasurably to get through this time. You know, it was, the days went quickly, you know, I felt productive, and I stopped putting a time frame that this has to be done. I just worked. I worked as much as I was able to and forgave myself for, you know, needing to take a nap occasionally because I was exhausted. You know, this was an exhausted time. You know, just an old student of mine called me in the middle of the pandemic and was really being hard on herself. You know, I'm not getting enough done. And I said to her, you know, you're alive. That's a full-time job. You know, this is cut yourself some slack. You know, that you're doing anything at all, pat yourself on the back. Just stay alive. You know, like that's a big thing. And we all know that. We're all slightly transformed or majorly transformed from, you know, talking to each other with masks on. You know, this is not what we used to do, but we're doing it. You know, and I'm so grateful to be here. I'm so grateful that I was able to do work. And so that's what I meant by go to the place you're most afraid to be. Because it's part of our lives. It's not the only part. There are, when we're lucky, there's moments of joy and release and freedom, but there's also other stuff. So I hope that answers it. Thank you.